We are in the last part of our Between the Porch and the Altar message, which is on the book of Job. And we are very excited about that because it moved really quick. We really did do it in about 3 weeks. And I broke it down because some of the chapters were long for really getting into, and I mean trying to take 2 and 3 chapters at once. And next week we will start our look at the book of Amos, which is the next minor prophet in the series. And if you guys want to look at it this week, you're more than welcome to. You know, this is not a cult. We don't tell you, you cannot move on until I do. But I really want to, first of all, say I'm really thankful for everybody who's here, and I really want to say that I'm really thankful for what God is showing us and for where God is moving us and for the things that God is doing, because looking at Joel and looking at Hosea and looking at all this stuff really makes me realize how different we have to be in order to really be God's people. In fact, that's my word of power for this week. The video blog is going to be, what does it mean? How does it look if we're called? And I look at Hosea for that because, as we've talked about, we don't look like everybody else. We don't think like everybody else. Look at the thinking and the spiritual depth that it took to be Joel, and to look at this devastation and look around and see something else. And I think that that's the bottom line of the book of Joel. I think that that's really the bottom line of what we always talk about and think about and go over and over and over again in our minds, because you want to know what? Every day of our lives we're confronted with the reality that we have to walk out of something. And I really think that that's the underlying message of the book of Joel. As I kind of prayed over and looked at it, somebody asked me about this week. They said, well, what were you talking about? And I said, go watch the video. I'm not giving you my sermon notes. But it made me think about what exactly is the underlying message. Every single one of us has to walk out of something. We have to walk out of stuff in our lives. We have to walk out of problems that we've had. We have to walk out of sin. I think that that's maybe even the underlying thing, because there's a lot of talk, particularly in all the minor prophets, about sin and about the sinfulness of Israel and about where Israel was. But you know what? We have to really look at ourselves, and we have to be willing to walk through stuff in order to come out on the other side, in order for it to be beneficial for another generation. And so I'm not going to do a whole big long recap of Joel because it's only 3 chapters long, but I'm going to say that the book of Joel is a real powerful look at where God is when things seem to be going wrong. And what I talk about is that porch and the altar place, that I think a lot of times in our lives we always wonder where God is, or why God isn't answering our prayers the way that we want, or why things aren't moving the way that we want. And especially in today's church, I think that we really question that. We look at people on TV and they seem to have it all. They seem to have the best of the spiritual world and the material world. They have the best houses and the best cars and the biggest churches. And they're giving us these messages, and people are hanging on to their every word. And if we step back and we look at where we're at, even if we're in lack, even if we're not maybe in total lack, but maybe we don't have as much as they have, or we're in lack because we want to do things that we can't really afford to do, or we don't have the means to do this, we kind of step back and we go, okay, God, what am I doing wrong? Or what do I need to look at? Or what do I need to examine? But Joel tells us that God is the same God and in the same place when we're having a hard time as when we're having a different time, as when we're having a better time or a good time or an interesting time. And in the interest of Joel, they really were experiencing devastation. It wasn't like they're having a bad day, or they stubbed their toe, or they broke their nail, or, you know, it was they had complete and total national devastation, probably more than just national devastation, because they had a locust invasion. And the book of Joel is kind of in 3 parts that kind of parallels the chapters that it's in, because there are 3 chapters. So chapter 1 is about the devastation of the locust invasion, and in the middle of that, how they sought God. They wanted to see where God was in it. Chapter 2 is acknowledgement that a spiritual response is the answer. And so that's something I think that we need to think about, because a lot of times we tell people to pray or we tell them to fast, but we don't actually have a spiritual response behind that. Sure, it's great to pray. I think praying is great. But a lot of times we're not praying right. We're not really praying for what the situation merits or requires. And so they sought God about it. And then in chapter 2, we also kind of start to see the spiritual response change, that they start looking at deeper things. And the spiritual response was both from the people and from the leaders. And so there was a synergy. There was something that kind of went together in there. There was something that went along with everything, and so the leaders stood with the people between the porch and the altar, and the people were kind of in this place where they were interceding and standing as well, where they were figuring out and handling what was going on in their lives. And so the priests stood with them, the leaders stood with them, and the people went through it, and together they all kind of came out with a purpose. And a little bit of chapter 2 and 3 relates to looking forward. So now we're going to kind of look forward. The reason that we're supposed to stop screaming the end is nigh all the time, and I think that that's very important with the apocalypticism that we have in our climate today. Anytime anything happens, it's the end of the world. Marijuana got legalized in Colorado, it's the end of the world. I don't know how one thing that happens in one state can be the end of the whole world. Especially given that it's been legal in other countries like in the Netherlands for many, many years. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, because I don't think that it's a good thing in that particular context. And I don't necessarily agree with stuff in that context. But how can one place in one little remote thing mean that it's the end of the entire world? And that really is kind of the context that we take to it. Gay marriage is legal, it's the end of the world. Well, in the United States, it's been legal in other countries for a couple of years. Actually, for at least going back a decade in parts of Europe. And the end wasn't then. And so why is it because it came and it touched us here the end of the world now? And I think that that's something that we need to think about. Now, once again, not saying that these aren't things we need to look at, not saying these aren't things we need to think about. But that in the context of the end of the world, 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 that always being thrown in our face every time anything happens. Obama got elected, it's the end of the world. Trump might get elected, it's the end of the world. This one might get elected, it's the end of the world. It's an election year, this is the end of the world. I stub my toe, it's the end of the world. That's literally, every time we overuse that, people don't take the end of the world seriously. They don't take it seriously. And so when we actually really start to talk about the realities of the end, people don't take them seriously. It's become Hollywood fodder. They've become movie plots with UFOs and wars and people invading from outer space. And there's always one guy, and it's always Tom Cruise or Mel Gibson or Harrison Ford or Sylvester Stallone, or one of them is going to come in and save the world from its end, and they're going to kick butt against, or Bruce Willis, I forgot him, and they're going to kick butt against these little green men, and coming down in spaceships with flying cars, and the woman is always out like this, and she's always being sacrificed by locusts or demons or something like that. She can't run apparently anymore because they all have on platform boots from the 70s that are like 10 inches tall. We've made it fodder, we've made it entertainment, and so people don't really look at the seriousness of it. But what happened in terms of Joel is that the seriousness of what was happening to them made them think about the end. It made them think about the day of judgment. It made them think, okay, if this is what's going on here, how much more serious do we need to take this other stuff? How much more serious do we need to take life and God and all that kind of stuff and take it in? And so we're going to go over to Joel 3, and we're going to start in verse 1, because it kind of gets an apocalyptic tone now to it. But it's a serious tone. It's not, here I come to save the day like a lot of them do in the movies. In those days, starting in verse 1, and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel, for they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. They cast lots for my people and traded boys for prostitutes. They sold girls for wine that they might drink. Now what have you against me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all you regions of Philistia? Are you repaying me for something I have done? If you are paying me back, I will swiftly and speedily return on your own heads what you have done. For you took my silver and my gold and carried off my finest treasures to your temples. You sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, that you might send them far from their homeland. So prophecy is given first about what it's going to mean, and about all nations being restored, about fortunes being restored. And what we talk about the nations, all nations being restored, is they're talking about the diaspora here, which is where basically the people of Israel were sent out into all nations. And so all those people of all nations are going to be called back in the end to Judah and Jerusalem, and things are going to be reset up. And the way that this kind of works to me, I think, is really interesting, because a lot of people talk about the diaspora and it being a bad thing, but the reality is that genetically, and if we talk about biology, we really don't know where the 12 tribes of Israel are now, because they have been so dispersed and they have been intermarried and all that sort of stuff down through the generations. Genetically, we really don't know where they are now. It would be an interesting thing to see. I can't vouch for like these DNA tests like Ancestry.com and stuff like that, if that's able to detect it, if it goes quite that far back or not. I don't really know. I've said, I think that if you watch the commercials, a lot of that stuff is a misnomer, because there's a difference between being raised culturally and maybe, for example, there's this one where a guy, they said, oh, I thought I married an Italian, and it turns out he's like 30-some-odd% Eastern European. And I said, well, that's a misnomer, because it may very well be true that genetically that's what his DNA is, but he may have been living, his family might have been Italian for generations and generations and generations, and so he's Italian. And that's the bottom line of it, and he can do whatever he wants to do genetically or in terms of the specific makeup, but that does not necessarily make him identifying with these other cultures. And so it's interesting biologically, but I don't know how accurate I would say it is culturally. And that also goes for diaspora too. If we think about what God does in terms of the church and about all nations coming together and about us coming together under Christ, it's really quite incredible, and it does fit this prophecy. Because if everybody's scattered, we don't know where they are. And so they very well may be finding God in the church. We very well may have people from these original backgrounds from church. The truth is, genetically, the majority of Jews in the world today do not fall into the category of coming from Judah or Jerusalem or from the Middle East. They are Eastern European. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that, is because genetically, biologically speaking, this diaspora is truly in all nations and is truly magnifying and microscopically in all the different cultures. And so, as far as it goes, God is going to call those He called. And I don't necessarily think it's a biological thing. I think it's a spiritual thing. I think it's people who are willing to give praise and peace. If we go with Judah, means praise. Jerusalem means place of peace. If we are willing to be people of that, if we are called of God, there shall come a time when we shall be called, we will be gathered together, and that we will go forth for His purpose. And so this talks about, once again, things changing in history and in time. How exactly it's going to happen, I don't know. The Bible really doesn't tell us. It really doesn't get that specific. It talks about gatherings. It talks about this stuff happening. Beyond that, I'm not going to speculate, because I think that it's not wise to do that. But it also talks about that we're going to go from people being judged and people not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which I think is important, because the first group that He judges are those who are His own. In other words, they didn't do the right thing. And I think that we need to start there, and I always say that we need to look at ourselves first. The church wants to point fingers at everything that's happening everywhere in the world, but we don't actually want to stand and look at ourselves, and I really believe that that is what we are called to do, because they didn't do the right thing. Then He starts with the nations around who also didn't do the right thing, and who led people into idolatry, and who took things they shouldn't have taken, and who did things they shouldn't have done, and who sold people, and who did all kinds of abominations. So, in other words, everybody is the same. What does it say? All have sinned and we all fall short of the glory of God. There isn't any special people, or, you know, if we're saved, it's by the grace of God. It is certainly not because of anything that we have done or anything that we're going to do or anything that we can do on our own. Verse 7. See, I'm going to rouse them out of the places to which you sold them, and I will return on your own heads what you have done. I will sell your sons and daughters to the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabians, a nation far away. The Lord has spoken. The Sabian people, according to what I understand, actually became a Gnostic group. There was a group called the Gnostic Sabians. And that was a religious group that kind of emerged in the early centuries of Christianity that makes Christianity a religion called of Zoroaster, which doesn't really exist anymore. They don't convert. I think there's like 100,000 of them left. There are pockets of them from the immigrants in parts of, I believe, Texas. There aren't any here. I'm actually kind of surprised, but they're Persian immigrants, and it's a Persian religion. And they kind of took some of the mystical aspects of that in Christianity and put it all together. And the Sabians, referring to that nation far away, was talking about those people before they emerged as a religion, before they emerged as something of that nature, but that they would be sold, sons and daughters, to the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabians. And so, in other words, those people would also be dispersed. It's not an endorsement of slavery. Before I get letters, before people tell me that the Bible endorses slavery, that's not what it's talking about at all. In other words, because they took and they sold people and dispersed them, that was what was going to happen prophetically to them. Verse 9. Proclaim this among the nations, prepare for war, rouse the warriors, let all the fighting men draw near and attack, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weaklings say, I am strong. I like that verse because we use it in all kinds of different contexts, and it's not necessarily used in the Bible in the exact same way that we use it. War is coming, battle is coming. And I think that more appropriately we're going to use the term battle, because I don't necessarily believe that all the battles that the Bible talks about are world wars. A lot of people think that in the end there's going to be this big, huge, massive world war, and this is going to come, and that's going to come, and people are going to be fighting. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm really not. But as we talked about in Bible study, there's also soul winning. There's also contending for life. There's also contending for the soul. There's also the spiritual war. And so if we're going to look at this from a spiritual perspective as well as something natural, we need to be prepared for spiritual conflict. And I don't think that we deal with that well today, because we so don't want to be hurting, and we so don't want to be uncomfortable, and we so don't want to go through that every time anything happens, we just start slugging other people. And I think that spiritual warfare isn't for that purpose. If we are told to let the weak say, I am strong, it's because they have to go to battle. And so, in other words, let the weak say, I am strong. In other words, pull yourself together and get yourself together and deal with the battle and deal with what you have to go through and move forward. And I think that one of the most powerful ways that we can engage in spiritual warfare is to go through, is to get through stuff. Instead of sitting around and spitting and, screaming in tongues and dancing in circles and making yourself sick and making yourself throw up and stomp and sweat and all that. Well, you don't have to do all that all the time. I don't even know if you ever have to do that much, ever, if you have to be that extra, ever. But we need to come together, and we need to be prepared for what God has for us for the future. We need to be people who don't let stuff destroy us. This locust invasion was destructive, but it didn't destroy the people. And it didn't destroy the people because they sought God through what they were going through, and they did what they needed to do. Verse 12, let the nations be roused, let them advance into the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the nations on every side. Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, trample the grapes, for the winepress is full, and the vats overflow, so great is their wickedness. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near, in the valley of decision. I'm going to stop there for a minute, because I think that probably that is one of the most important verses in the book of Joel. We talk all the time about people needing to make decisions, and we talk every single day about judgment, and people say, well, we judge things all day long. Well, that very well may be true. But the catch or the secret behind what's going on in the spiritual realm and in the natural realm is that there are multitudes of people who have to make a decision. And I'm not just going to say a decision about spirituality or a decision about salvation, although I do believe that there are multitudes there. And I do believe that it applies for that. Every single day, we still have to make that decision all over again. And that's the thing that we miss in Christianity today. I've said, I don't believe that the way that we teach on salvation is really either or. We talk about Calvinism, which is predestination, or Arminianism, where you can lose your salvation, or this, or that, or something else. And I said, I don't think that they had that understanding. I think that we're trying to look at the Bible and walk away with understandings that they didn't have in the first century. They were trying to walk out their salvation. They were trying to figure this thing out every day, day in and day out. And I think that that's the catch. Every single day we can turn our back on God. Every single day we always have the choice to walk away from Him. Every single day we don't have to do what God wants us to do. And so there are multitudes that are in that valley of decision who need this spiritual insight, who need this stuff that we talked about earlier in Joel, who need the church to pray, who need the church to be on her knees and look at God and intercede for them. We need people who are willing to stand with them between the porch and the altar. We need people who are willing to help them make the decision that is right. Because not every single decision is as black and white as right or wrong. Salvation is a decision that's right for everybody. But sometimes people are in situations where we need to help them do what's right for them. Because if we keep teaching on things the way that we often do, we're not helping them to get there. And it doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that the Word doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that we don't stand upon the Word. But there's an awful lot of different circumstances that present themselves in the Bible that have different outcomes. And that what God is teaching us in that is that sometimes we have to step back and help people right where they are. You know what? You're right. It's right that somebody gets off drugs. That's what's right for that person in that particular interest. It is not right that they're hooked on them. And somebody else's right decision is that they don't get hooked on them in the first place. And so in those valleys of decision, there's an example where people's circumstances are different and where we need to help them do what's right for them and get them out of that eternal battle for their soul. Get them to where they can contend for themselves, because people come to us with different circumstances. And we're not ever going to sit somewhere and look at a drug addict and say, oh, it's all right, you can keep using, you know, it's fine, don't worry about it. But that's different for somebody who's being challenged with using for the first time. And so being able to be perspective enough and be there for the people enough and to give them the hug when they need it and to stand with them when they need it and bring them out of desolation or avoid them going into it in the first place is how we can help people in the valley of decision. Because the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. In other words, judgment is near. When we are in those places where we are not making right decisions and we are not helping people to think about eternity and think about bigger pictures in their own context, in their own situation, we're not doing our job. We need to do our job and help people get out of that place of the valley of decision and to move towards something greater and something deeper. Verse 15, the sun and the moon will be darkened, and the stars no longer shine. The Lord will roar from Zion and thunder from Jerusalem. The earth and the sky will tremble, but the Lord will be a refuge for His people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. Then you will know that I, the Lord your God, dwell in Zion, my holy hill. Jerusalem will be holy. Never again will foreigners invade her. So that also tells us prophetically that there will always be foreign invasion in Jerusalem until He comes back again. No matter what anybody might think, no matter what anybody might try to do or teach, that is not going to come about until the time when that refuge and that stronghold comes forth and that foreigners are no longer invading Jerusalem. And I really believe that refers to the New Jerusalem that will come down from heaven. And in other words, that when we will know that God is God, when we're out of that valley of decision, when we're out of that constant decision-making place, because when you're in that kind of a place, you don't have peace. And so God is calling His people to peace and the place of peace, and God will be a refuge for His people. And so we need to make our decisions and trust that God is in them. And trust that God is there so that we can help somebody else get out of the valley of decision. I mean, some of us agonize and agonize and agonize, just like people agonize today over Jerusalem. We need to stop agonizing, and we need to be able to be at peace and have churches of peace and houses of peace and lives of peace, because that's where God calls us to be. Verse 18. In that day the mountains will drip new wine and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of acacias. Or valley of Shittim. I have that also in my footnotes. But Egypt will be desolate, Edom a desert waste, because of violence done to the people of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood. Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem throughout all generations. Their blood guilt, which I have not pardoned, I will pardon, because the Lord dwells in Zion. He dwells in his place of peace. And I think that that's what God wants us to look at. I think that that's what God wants us to hear. That in the noise of the world, there's a line in a hymn that they sing at Christmas time, which is, it came upon a midnight clear, and there's a verse where they say, and hush your noise and cease your strife and hear the angels sing. And that's where I think that we need to be at this point in our lives. There's so much conflict and so much anger and so much bitterness, and there are so many circumstances. We can always look at a circumstance and not find God in it. We can always look at a desolating thing and not believe that God is there. We can always go through a trying period and not recognize it. But the longer that we keep staying there, the more we don't get up. The more we don't walk through it, the more we don't move to it, because inevitably, whether it's metaphorical, whether it's all literal, whether some of it's metaphorical and some of it's literal and some of it's illustration and some of it's not, the day is coming when we will have to face God. And there was a writer, his name was Albert Camus, who used to say, don't wait for the final judgment, it happens every day. And I liked that, and it still kind of sits with me, and it still kind of resonates with me, because every single day people die. Every single day we do things, and we do things to face God's judgment. And this final judgment that's coming, we need to be prepared for. And so we need to open up our minds and open up our eyes, and I'm going to say, open up that place between the porch and the altar. It needs to be okay for us to dialogue. It needs to be okay for us to ask questions. It needs to be okay for us to step back and say, I'm going through a hard time. Where is God in what I'm going through? How can I find him better? And for us to rise up and say, you know what, you're in a valley of decision, and we're going to stand with you, and we're going to get you out of that. We're going to pray you out of that. We are going to equip you to get where you need to go. And for us to be able to stand back and say that the promise can still be ours today. I believe that prophecy is threefold. It's happened in the day, and so it's literal for that day. It's literal for all time. And I think that there's always a little bit of futuristic stuff in prophecy. So that also means that the promise can be ours today too, that we can get past the desolation and get to the promise. We can get to the altar from the porch. And even though we might spend a lot of time in the middle, we can get there. And so what I ask and what I pray for the church to do is to pick itself up. And we need to stop going over the same Bible verses over and over again. We need to stop standing on the same things that don't get us through because we're not interpreting them right. We need to say, let the weak say, I am strong, and stand up and be prepared for the battle that God calls us into. We need to stand up and be ready to fight and contend for the souls of other people, and to contend for our own. You know, a lot of times we go running and we want somebody else to pray for us. Well, we can pray for ourselves too. We can contend for ourselves if we can't find anybody else. We can get in there and we can say, you know what, I'm going to fight for myself, and I'm going to hear God for myself, and I'm not going to get up from this place until I hear from God. We can make that resolve. But the bottom line that God wants us to hear through all of this is, as we pick ourselves up and move ourselves out, and as we look at what happens, there is hope after desolation. There is hope after a season of loss. And there is hope even when you're faced with the most difficult of choices.